The military of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth evolved from the merger of the armies of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, following the 1569 Union of Lublin, which formed the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The army was commanded by the Hetmans of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The most unique formation of the army was the heavy cavalry in the form of the Polish winged hussars. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Navy never played a major role in the military structure and ceased to exist in the mid-17th century. Commonwealth forces were engaged in numerous conflicts in the south, the east and the north, as well as internal conflicts. For the first century or so, the Commonwealth military was usually successful, but became less so from around the mid-17th century. Plagued by insufficient funds, it found itself increasingly hard-pressed to defend the country, and inferior in numbers to the growing armies of the Commonwealth's neighbors. Following the end of the Commonwealth, the Polish military tradition would be continued by Napoleonic Polish legions and the Army of the Duchy of Warsaw. Background: the Commonwealth was formed at the Union of Lublin of 1569, from the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The armies of those states differed from the organization common in the west of Europe, as according to Bardach, the mercenary formations, common there, never gained popularity in Poland. Brzezinski, however, notes that foreign mercenaries did form a significant portion of the more elite infantry units, at least till the early 17th century. In the 15th century Poland, several other formations formed the core of the military. There was a small standing army, Obrona Potoczna, about 1,500–3,000 strong, paid for by the king, and primarily stationed at the troubled south and eastern borders. It was supplemented by two formations mobilized in case of war, the Pospolite Rusyni and the Wojsko Zaciężne, recruited by the Polish commanders for the conflict. Several years before the Union of Lublin, the Polish Obrona Potoczna was reformed, as the Sejm legislated in 1562–1563 the creation of Wojsko Kwarczane. This formation was also paid for by the king, and in the peacetime, numbered about 3,500–4,000 men according to Bardach. Brzezinski gives the range of 3,000–5,000. It was composed mostly of the light cavalry units, manned by nobility and commanded by hetmans. Often, in wartime, the Sejm would legislate a temporary increase in the size of the Wojsko Kwarczane. Operational history: at its heyday, the Commonwealth comprised the territories of present-day Poland, and large parts of Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Russia. It was engaged in the struggles along most of its borders, with only the western border with the lands of the Holy Roman Empire being relatively peaceful. In its first decades, major conflicts included the Livonian campaign of Stephen Bathory, the interventions in Moldavia, the Danzig Rebellion, and the war against Sigismund. Early 17th century saw a number of the Polish-Swedish Wars, the Polish-Ottoman Wars, and the Polish-Russian Wars. The Commonwealth also suffered from a number of Cossack uprisings, culminating in the devastating Chmielnicki uprising of 1648. That period also saw some of the Commonwealth's most talented military commanders: Stanislaw Olkiewski, Jan Karol Chodkiewicz, Stanislaw Konispolski, and Stefan Czarniecki. The Commonwealth managed to hold its weight in most of those conflicts, and scored a number of major victories on all fronts, such as the Battle of Kharkiv, the Battle of Klashino, and had briefly garrisoned Moscow. However, the Chmielnicki uprising, together with the Russo-Polish War and the Swedish Deluge, all taking place around the same period of the 1650s, proved devastating for the country, resulting in a loss of most of Ukraine to Russia in the Treaty of Andrusovo in 1667. In 1683 the Commonwealth scored its last major victory that resounded on the European scene, the relief of Vienna by King Jan III Sobieski. During the 18th century, European powers fought several wars for the control of the territories of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, particularly during the Great Northern War. By the end of the 18th century, a series of internal conflicts and wars with foreign enemies led to the dissolution of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the partitioning of most of its dependent territories among other European powers. The final attempt to preserve independence of the Commonwealth, including the political reforms of the Great Sejm, eventually failed on the military front, with the Commonwealth defeats in the Polish-Russian War of 1792 and the Kosciuszko Uprising of 1794, ultimately ending in Poland's final partition and the final dissolution of the remains of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Composition. Organization. By the time of the Commonwealth formation, there was little practical difference between the Polish and Lithuanian components. The Lithuanian component formed about a fourth to a third of the Commonwealth Army. The Army of the Commonwealth was organized along several different models, with the primary division being that into two contingents or enlistments, national and foreign. The name applied to types of formation, regulations and the officer cadres. The majority of regular recruits for both came from within the Commonwealth, particularly from the 1630s onward. National units included the Tartars cavalry and petty horse units, and some light cavalry units, with infantry being the distant second in reputation, whereas the foreign units were primarily centered around the infantry and artillery formations, with dragoons gaining prominence from the 1620s and Reiter cavalry soon afterward. The Polish-Lithuanian national contingent was organized in traditional formations dating back to the earlier medieval times, with Kyrgyz unit, commanded by a rotmistress and composed of smaller pegzei retinues, each composed of one Taurus and a varying number of aides. The size of a Kyrgyz could vary from as little as 60 to as many as 300 men. To a more Korogwe formed a regiment unit, a type of a unit similar to the medieval battle, a modern division, a corps. Its senior commander was known as Polkovnik. The foreign contingent was organized into regiments, are often numbering around 500–1,000, and divided into companies. King Jan III Sobieski made an attempt in the 1670s to replace the national foreign contingent divisions with a single structure, dividing units into infantry, cavalry and dragoons, but it would take many decades before those reforms bore fruit. Formations and their evolution. After the creation of the Commonwealth, several new types of military units were introduced. First among these were the registered Cossacks, formed in 1578. These were the troops made up of Cossacks, paid for the service and not subject to serfdom. The numbers varied from about 500 to many times that number, with the Treaty of Zaborov setting the record at 40,477. The Cossacks' refusal to submit to serfdom, and the Commonwealth's nobility attempts to force them into it led to much political wrangling with regard to the size of the Cossack register, and to numerous Cossack uprisings, particularly in the 17th century. These weakened the state, and eventually led to the Cossack subjugation and destruction by the Russian Empire. In addition to the Cossack formations, another group that provided notable service to the Polish state were the Tartars, some of whom resided in Lithuania and were Commonwealth subjects. Known as Lipka Tartars, they provided some light and medium cavalry units for the Lithuanian army. In the late 16th century, during the reign of Stefan Batory, a peasant-based levy formation, Piechota y Branica, was formed. It was based on peasants from the royal estates only, who received a unit of land in exchange for the service. The formation numbered about 2,300 and after early disappointments was never seen as of much military value. It supplemented the few small units of Hajduk infantry, which saw service in Poland primarily around late 16th and 17th centuries. In 1655 a new infantry unit was created, the hussars.The. It required all lands, no matter whether owned by king, nobles of the church, to provide peasant recruits, and applied a similar requirement to towns. Starting in 1613, the growing inefficiencies of the central government, as well as an increase in foreign threats, led to the creation of a local territorial defense force, known as hussars.The. The artillery formations, at first staffed by foreigners, were reformed in the 1630s, with a new tax levied to support them. This time also marked the introduction of the general of the artillery post into the Commonwealth Army. In the mid-17th century, the numbers of Wojsko-Zaciezna and Kwarczany proved to be insufficient, which led to the creation of Wojsko Computo. Wojsko Computo numbered 26,000. At the same time, Wojsko Kwarczany was disbanded, and Kwarta directed towards the newly created artillery forces. Brzezinski notes that Wojsko Kwarczany was dissolved in the aftermath of its defeat at the Battle of Bato in 1652. In 1659, in aftermath of a series of wars, the reformed army numbered around 54,000–60,000. It would decline from that point onward, as the country, impoverished from those wars, would not be able to support such a number again. Another element of the Commonwealth Army consisted of various private armies fielded by the most powerful magnates. In time of peace these consisted of usually small regiments of a few hundred men, but at their extreme they could number up to 10,000, including cavalry and artillery. In some instances the magnate contribution could surpass that of the main Commonwealth Army on the front lines, although often the magnates preferred to save the troops, as they were not compensated for the state for the contributions. The troops were paid for and equipped by the richest of the noble families, such as the Opolinski, Lubomirski, Potocki, Ossolinsky, Zamoyski, Konispolski, Sieniewski, Olkiewski, Sapieta, Chodkovich, Pak and Radziwill families. This was one of the reasons why the magnates played a major role in Polish politics, and on occasion, allowed them to engage in bloody civil wars amongst themselves. Similarly, occasional forces of town guard and militia were fielded by some cities. The most impressive town guard and accompanying fortifications belonged to the port of Gdansk, which in 1646 boasted 12 infantry companies of 6,000 men total. There was also a small Royal Guard regiment, paid for directly by the king. In peacetime, the Royal Guard numbered around 1,200, but would often be expanded during time of war. The royal force included a hussar banner, a cavalry element, and an infantry unit based upon the foreign model. Finally, there were also some irregular militia or mercenary troops which received no official pay but operated with the permission of the government and were allowed to retain the loot. Most notable of these were the Lysochisi mercenary group, which operated in the first half of the 17th century. Both the state and the magnates supported the construction and renovations of several fortifications. Command structure. The Army of the Commonwealth was commanded by King, under who served 4 hetmans, 2 grand hetmans and 2 field hetmans. The office of a hetman appeared in the late 15th century as a consequence of the introduction of the Wojsko-Zaciezna, and a need for a more professional army commanders than the king could usually provide. By the 1530s the hetman system has evolved into that of regular officers forces that would exist both in Poland and Lithuania for the next 3 centuries. From 1581 it became officially a lifelong appointment. Hetmans had the right to carry out summary justice in the field. Grand Crown Hetman had the right to maintain his representatives in the Ottoman Empire, which allowed him to influence Poland-Ottoman relations and also laid groundwork for the first Polish intelligence services. Hetman deputy was known as regimentats and could replace a hetman on a temporary basis. Navy. The Commonwealth Navy was small and played a relatively minor role in the history of the Commonwealth. Despite having access to the Baltic Sea, neither Poland nor Lithuania had any significant navy throughout the histories. In the 16th century, as Poland and Lithuania became involved in conflicts in Livonia, Polish King Zygmunt August supported the operations of privateers, but that met with opposition of the Poland's primary port, Gdansk, which saw them as a threat to its trade operations. This led to the development of a privateer port in Puck. At the turn of the century, Poland became ruled by the House of Vasa and was involved in a series of wars with Sweden. Vasa kings attempted to create a proper fleet, and Vladislav IVWAZA built a dedicated port for the Royal Navy, but their attempts met with repeated failures due to lack of funds in the royal treasury. Although Vladislav bought 12 ships, they were sold between 1641 and 1643, marking the end of the Commonwealth Navy. Logistics and tactics. Due to lack of centralized logistical system, the Polish armies were encumbered by large baggage trains. To some degree, this was turned into an advantage with the development of the Tabor military horse-drawn wagons, usually carrying army supplies. The wagon used for defensive formations was perfected by the Cossacks, and to a smaller extent used by other Commonwealth units. The Commonwealth Army relied on cavalry, which the nobility saw as a much more respectable type of a troop than the infantry. Despite the reforms of the 17th century, it lost much of its military significance in the 18th century. The primary reason for this was a lack of sufficient funding. Problems and reforms. With the growing influence of foreign powers in the Commonwealth, the Russian-dominated Silent Sejm of 1717 declared that the size of the Commonwealth Army should be 24,200. Due to insufficient taxation, the military was often not paid properly, which led to a relatively small army size. In mid-18th century, the Commonwealth had funds to field an army of around 24,000, whereas the Commonwealth's neighbors' armies were often up to 12 times larger. The Imperial Russian Army numbered 300,000, the Prussian Army and Imperial Austrian Army 150,000, and a few decades later, the Commonwealth could field an army of about 16,000, with Prussian and Austrian armies rising to 200,000. The stated size of the Commonwealth Army was further exaggerated, as some money was lost due to corruption. The first half of the 18th century, following the 1717 Sejm, marks the nadir of the Commonwealth Army, as it lacked funds and training, and was primarily used for ceremonial purposes. The only constructive reform of that time was the introduction of a stable budget for the military. Furthermore, the unpaid units of the army were known for mutinying and forming confederations, occupying the Commonwealth's own lands until such a time that they were paid properly or pillaged enough to satisfy themselves. The trend reversed itself following the election of the last king of Poland, Stanislaw August Poniatowski, in 1765, and the introduction of the new governing body, Permanent Council, in 1775. Its military department attempted to modernize the army. and increase its size. A major military reform came with the passing of the Constitution of May 3, 1791, which stated that the army was to be built up to 100,000 men. A new conscription law was introduced, affecting all lands. With the days of the Commonwealth numbered, the constitution was never fully implemented in practice, although the new military commission saw the army expanded to 65,000 before the Polish defeat in the war in defense of the constitution. After the Commonwealth defeat in that war and the rescinding of the constitution, the army was reduced to about 36,000. In 1794, Russians demanded a further downsizing of the army to 15,000. This plan was one of the sparks that led to the army's final conflict, the Kosciuszko Uprising.